to the Cultural Logic YouTube channel. I'm Jeet here. I'm a columnist at The Nation magazine, where I also do a podcast called The Time of Monsters. This week, I want to talk about a book that I've reviewed, and I want to say a bunch more about it, and also tied in with some contemporary events. Uh, the book is Sam Tannenhaus's biography of William F. Buckley Jr. It's a massive tome, more than 20 years in the making. This is actually a galley edition. The 1,000 pages, 800 in the main stuff, and then like 200 pages of notes, which you should actually read because there's a lot of valuable stuff in there as well. Um, and but to tie this book in with some stuff that's going on in the news, which is that the open, overt anti-Semitism that is basically akin to Nazism is gaining a new kind of foothold in the American right, and we see this over the last week because Tucker Carlson, who has a very popular podcast, had on Nick Fuentes, who is, an avowed Holocaust denier, very openly hostile to Jews. Um, and a rising figure on the right. And Fuentes already, as someone who had in 2022 dined with Donald Trump and the artist formerly known as G, formerly known as Kanye. The um, and I mean, Carlson himself is a bit of a disreputable figure. But what became notable is that the Heritage Foundation, which is a very powerful think tank with a lot of ties with Donald Trump, the sort of, it is the uh, Death Star that constructed Project uh, 2025. Um, the Heritage Foundation, the head of it, was pressured to disavow Tucker Carlson, and he very forthrightly said he was not going to do that. And what's more to the point, JD Vance was asked a lot of questions that were basically coming from the Nick Fuentes wing of the party, and was basically trying to placate that wing. This sort of explains why Vance was talking about his South Asian wife, who's Hindu, and how he wishes she would convert to Christianity, and also making noises about how it's okay to not want neighbors who don't speak the same language as you. I mean, all these remarks um, can be understood as growing out of the rising power of Nick Fuentes. Now, when people talk about this stuff, there's a kind of mythical version of history that they present, and this is very much tied to the figure that William F. Buckley is often presented as being. And the myth goes something like this: there has been an extremist fringe right filled with anti-Semites and overt racists. But William F. Buckley came along. He's a more intellectual figure. He drove out the cranks, the conspiracy theorists, the Jew haters, the racist, and presented a much more respectable right, intellectual right that one could engage with in terms of debate. Um, this is a myth that Buckley himself very carefully crafted. One sees elements of it in books that his colleagues at National Review magazine promoted. I'm thinking of Jeffrey Hart's American Descent. Also, a very influential book by historian George Nash, The American Conservative Movement since 1945, which is basically the kind of Buckley National Review version of history. And that also has this story of, how Buckley took a movement that was filled with these outlandish, ugly, bigoted figures and made it much more respectable. This version of history is untrue. It is transparently self-serving on behalf of Buckley. And I think one of the great virtues of Tannenhaus's book is that it although written by someone who was friends with Buckley and liked him a great deal, and tries to present an imaginatively sympathetic account of his life, still presents the basic facts in a way that one can see that this is all a myth. Um, so I want. I think we have to backtrack a little bit and ask like who Buckley is and what his place in history is, and how he uh, sits in and why he's worthy of a 1,000-page biography, to be frank. And not just this biography, he's actually was the subject of an earlier biography, which I would also recommend, by John Judis, William F. Buckley, patron saint of American conservatives. And has been the subject of many books, many of which he wrote himself. He was a sort of prolific memoirist, many written by his colleagues at National Review magazine, as well as his son Christopher. So he's just a much written about figure, but worthy of being written about. He is actually a very important figure. And so a brief sort of summary. So he's like sort of born in 1925 in this a family of a very wealthy Texas oil man who has all these interests in Mexico and Venezuela. And the father, William F. Buckley Sr., is very much a figure of the early 20th century reactionary right. He's an admirer of the fascist dictator Franco. He's involved with counter-revolutionary efforts in Mexico to overthrow the democratic regime of that country. He's, Tannenhaus describes him as, like a sort of wannabe Hispanic grandee. So one can imagine the sort of type of figure that has a large landed estate and like literal ties with death squads, and also very reactionary in an American sense, like a counter-revolutionary, not just in Mexico but in America, very much opposed to the New Deal, the civil rights movement, believed that African Americans were inferior. They had a paternalistic relationship, where they had a large estate in South Carolina, and like he'd be one of the people who would pride himself on the way he looked after his black servants, but certainly not wanting social equality with them. And also very, very anti-Semitic. I mean, basically seeing Jews as inherently untrustworthy and treasonous. And Buckley Jr. grew up in that environment, which also included Charles Lindbergh and the sort of what is called isolationist foreign policy, but America First nationalism, averse to fighting Hitler, seeing fascism as less of a threat than communism, and frankly, fascism as a bulwark against communism. And Buckley Jr., grew up with all these views and shared them. Uh, at one point, it's a large Catholic family, and the at one point in the late 1930s, the older Buckley children went out and to a Jewish resort, and they burned a cross in front of it in what the family considered to be like a prank. And Buckley, in one of his books, says like his great regret was that he wasn't able to join in that. Now he would later disavow this sort of anti-Semitism, but I mean that's where the family was coming from. And growing out of that environment, Buckley, comes of age during World War II and after World War II, goes to Yale, famously becomes a big man at Yale, joins the notorious Skull and Bones fraternity, is editor in chief of the Yale uh, Daily News newspaper, which is a big position, gets into many fights with his professors, and coming out of Yale, writes a big book, God and Man at Yale, which is one of the sort of foundational books of the post-war reaction. And that's basically Buckley's political position, that he is taking the extreme old right politics of his father and adapting it for the new Cold War America. And that meant certain changes, like, although the family had supported Robert Taft, they had evolved towards accepting the sort of Cold War consensus, with Buckley basically, frankly, saying in Commonweal magazine in the early 50s that, if we require a totalitarian bureaucracy at home to fight the Cold War, then so be it. But in that post-war environment, picking up on the sort of using the Cold War as a sledgehammer to go after liberalism, and especially New Deal liberalism, and becoming a very strong supporter of Joseph McCarthy and the sort of right-wing revival. And this right-wing revival was aimed at challenging liberalism not only within the Democratic Party but also in the Republican Party. This was a sort of, in mid-century America, the two parties both were ideologically diverse, with both having conservative and liberal elements. And particularly, with the success of the New Deal, the Republicans, liberals, and moderates had won, and Dwight Eisenhower became president. And the new conservative movement that Buckley kind of became the leading figure of wanted to get depose of moderate republicanism and replace it with turn the Republican Party into a forthrightly right wing party. And that was a hugely successful political project. And Buckley was not just a pundit, but an organizer, bringing together various factions of the right to create National Review magazine in 1955, which became the sort of cornerstone intellectual flagship magazine of the right. Organizing at his estate in Connecticut, Young Americans for Freedom, which became a very powerful student group organizing the right on campuses. And along with his colleagues at National Review, particularly publisher William Rusher, working, and his brother-in-law L. Brent Brazel, working to promote Barry Goldwater. And National Review, although they had their arguments with Goldwater, really was the sort of intellectual basis of the Goldwater movement, and organizing basis. And the coup that Goldwater pulled off in 1964, of being a frankly right wing takeover of the Republican Party, and changed that party. It changed American politics. It was in the beginning of the Southern strategy, because although Goldwater lost massively, he was the first Republican ever to really win states in the South, and that created a realignment of American politics that led up to Ronald Reagan, and later what we see with Trump, a Republican Party that is much more forthrightly right wing. And Buckley did this, writing books, publishing a magazine, became host 1965 in a show, Firing Line. Previous year had run for mayor of New York unsuccessfully, but again with a kind of goal of deposing of the liberal Republicans, and creating a splinter within the right so that a liberal Republican could not win. Um, and just a very successful political figure who massively changed American politics through this conservative movement. And so, worthy of a biography. And I think Tannenhouse is a worthy successor to John Judis's earlier very fine biography. I actually find Judis a little bit preferable on some degree in terms of ideological analysis. That Judis is a political reporter with a much sharper sense of the sort of various factions of the right, of the sort of old right, libertarians, the sort of new right populist, Cold War conservatives, and he can deftly explain these positions, and the people who held them, like James Burnham, in a way that I don't actually think Tannenhouse is quite as comfortable on that territory. But having said that, I mean, I think one thing that Tannenhouse has other virtues that compensate for that. He's a much more literary writer, much more able to give an account of Buckley's social milieu, the world he came from. And this is very important. I mean, Buckley was very much a kind of social operator. Uh, I would not describe him as a great thinker by any means, but that's not necessary. I mean, he was like an organizer, and he created a sort of he did the sort of work that Gramsci sees intellectuals as doing, as forming ideological alliances and blocks that can gain hegemony. And his very lack of intellectual depth helped him. Like the people at National Review, the libertarians like Frank Meyer, the Christian conservatives like L. Brent Bozell, the Cold Warriors like James Burnham, they were always fighting amongst themselves. But Buckley was the one figure that could kind of bring everyone together and create this intellectually incoherent but politically sturdy alliance. So, I mean, he never wrote, as some of his friends wanted him to, like the big, deep philosophical book on conservatism. But I mean, that was not who he was. Um, but he certainly created a lasting intellectual infrastructure that was very successful. Uh, so on all these grounds, very important. But one thing that his sort of social skills also allowed him to do was ingratiate himself with liberals. And this is a real theme in Tannenhaus's book. And Tannenhaus himself was a liberal, basically a centrist who was sort of charmed by Buckley, as many people have been. And this is not like a fake thing with Buckley. He was a genuinely, charming man. I think Tannenhaus rightly says that he had a kind of warmth to him that men often don't have, like like a real ability to of empathy and sympathy. And a lot of people who didn't share his politics, really put their trust in him and socialized with him. The columnist Murray Kempton, the economist John Kenneth Galbraith, um, many figures of this sort. But that maybe gets us to this kind of like myth of Buckley and why this, common idea of the Buckley as the guy who got rid of the anti-Semites, got rid of the conspiratorial John Birch Society. That's all not quite true, because I think one reads in Tannenhaus's book, and this is also in Judis as well, is that Buckley was very close to all these like far right extremists. And I should mention there's a larger trend in the sort of historiography of the American right that Tannenhaus is very much sort of building on, that has challenged the more Buckley friendly version of history. There's books like Edward Miller's Conspiratorial Life, which is a biography of the founder of Robert Walsh, the founder of the John Birch Society. David Austin Walsh's Taking Back America, a really strong sort of history of the relationship between the respectable right and the far right. Nicole Hemmer's Partisans, which deals with the sort of like 1990s and the rise of the kind of new populist right. And John Ganz's When the Clock Broke, dealing with a dealing with the same period. And all these books, um, they challenge this idea that there's a respectable right on the hand of Buckley, which is intellectual and high-minded and non-bigoted, and an extremist fringe right that is a danger. And what they all emphasize is that there's actually porous boundaries between these two, that there's always lines of communication and influence, and people go from one to the other. And I think another theme of all these books is that the extremist radical right never went away. That like if Buckley was able to marginalize the extremists, then like why have we always had a very extreme, influential right wing? I mean, and certainly the story that's often told is, well, there's the John Birch Society who had like all these kooky conspiratorial views. They thought that uh, uh, the Eisenhower was a communist and John Foster Dulles was a communist. And Buckley came along and he said, no, no, we won't have any of that. And he pushed, excommunicated the Birch Society from the right. Well, what Miller and other historians have shown is that the um, Birch Society never went away, and it actually, continued to have many members and be very influential, and continues to this day. And in many ways, a lot of their points of view, a lot of their conspiratorial points of view, is a direct precursor to Trumpism. Now, Buckley, we already discussed, he was coming out of, through his father, the old right, and in the 1950s, very a stout defender of Joseph McCarthy and very close friends with Roy Cohn, who also became the mentor of Donald Trump. And the one point that Trump is mentioned in the Tannenhouse biography is, when he was in sort of legal trouble and about to be disbarred, and two people that wrote letters on his behalf were William F. Buckley Jr. and Donald Trump, among others. Cohen also had many other respectable friends. And also National Review, and Buckley through his father. One of his main intellectual mentors was Albert J. Nock, who lived with the family for a while. Very influential, kind of libertarian leaning thinker, but also very anti-Semitic. And in the course of, and Buckley himself, at Yale, one of his friends at Yale, Tom Ginsburg, fell in love with one of his sisters, and Buckley was usually quite happy to have the uh, one of his friends fall in love with the sister. He loved that. He had a lot of friends. He had a lot of sisters. He loved to be the kind of um, uh, matchmaker who brings people together. But when Ginsburg fell in love with Buckley's sister Jane Buckley, both the old man William F. Buckley Sr. and Buckley himself, they said, well, we can't have this. It's stupid to marry. Buckley told us to Tannenhouse, it's stupid to marry a Jew. Um, and they broke up that, which caused a lot of bitterness with Tom Ginsburg, and was a great source of unhappiness for Jane. Although she didn't find out about her brother's role in all this until much later. And but in the sort of 1950s, that sort of anti-Semitism, was much less respectable, and Buckley did try to tone it down. But he had a lot of anti-Semitic people writing for him in National Review, including the man who was the de facto first book review editor of the magazine, Ravello Oliver, a classicist, rabid racist and anti-Semite, and later, prominent in the John Birch Society, kicked out of the John Birch Society for being too extreme, and then basically became one of the founders of the sort of neo-Nazi movement in America. And he, Buckley said, this was one of my closest friends. Now, I think what one has to say about Buckley, and with the John Birch Society as well, Buckley was very close to Robert Walsh, praised him greatly, the founder of the John Birch Society, extravagantly, describing some of Walsh's pamphlets as, like great writing, took money from Walsh. Buckley's own mother was a member of the John Birch Society, and basically um, worked with the John Birch Society to do their great project of taking over the Republican Party. I mean, the Birch Society was essential. They unlike National Review, they were a mass movement. Had many kind of people involved who helped in '64 to do this great project of winning the primaries. Now Buckley, he realized that for his respectable liberal friends, for the Murray Kemptons and John Kenneth Galbraiths of the world, the Birchers were beyond the pale. And so he had to do this kind of delicate dance, um, So he first of all, started just by, like trying to be critical of Robert Welsh. So, the British Society is fine, but Robert Welsh, you know, this guy who thought that Eisenhower was a communist, okay, okay, this guy's too far, but, we welcome the support of Birchers. And he did this until the Goldwater takeover. And then in 1965, the John Birch Society came out against the Vietnam War. Not for the sound reason that it was a stupid war, but because they thought, well, Washington's already overrun by communists. This war is obviously just some sort of ploy by the communists to get us involved in a land war. And it's at that point, for Cold War reasons, that National Review disavowed the Birch Society, but also notably after Goldwater. Um, had already taken over the party and the project was successful. Like once Goldwater takes over, then from that point on, the Republican Party always has to recognize that the radical right is a big component of the party. And I think Tannenhouse has a passage where he describes the relationship between the British Society and National Review in the 19 um, 50s, which is very on point. Um, while Buckley and National Review were trying to win over liberal journalists and intellectuals and meeting them publicly in debate, Walsh was shepherding the movement's infantry. So what you have is basically a movement with two wings: the respectable intellectual wing of National Review, and the movement organizers. And I think that National Review very much operated with a sense that we have to have like some cooperation or some sort of leeway with these people who actually have connections and ties with the mass of the right. And so things like the British Society continued, the Liberty Lobby, which had a magazine called the Spotlight, which had a much larger circulation than National Review, and was like openly anti-Semitic. All of these were like components of the right, and there was a kind of shell game that was played where Buckley could be the respectable face. Occasionally cooperate with these extremists, occasionally bring them even into his magazine, but then if they became too controversial, to disavow them. And on the right, this was seen as, well, Buckley's acting as a pope, or he's excommunicating us, or as a gatekeeper. But actually, this was like, this actually helped the right. It actually allowed them to, gain a foothold in both camps in this sort of respectable politics, while also doing mass organization of the sort of crackpots and the sort of agitational work of the far right. And I think this pattern continued throughout Buckley's life. I mean, Tannenhouse says, well, Buckley was not, a scientific racist, although he had sort of culturally racist views. Yes, but he also always was willing to publish scientific racist in national reviews. In the 60s, Ernst van Hagen, later Arthur Jensen and Charles Murray. So these were always like part of the National Review coalition. And I mean, one critique I would have of Tannenhouse is that basically after 75, the book becomes much shorter. He, spends 700 pages in the first 50 years of Buckley's life. Buckley has another, 30 plus years more to go till he dies in the early 21st century. But Tannenhouse, um, uh, the like covers the last few decades of Buckley's life very swiftly. And I think that if he had given it adequate depth, he could have done much more with Buckley's relationship with Pat Buchanan and Joseph Soburn. Now, Soburn was a very Buchanan came out of the National Review, right? Had friends in the magazine, and Joseph Soburn was a very important writer and editor of the magazine, starting in the 70s and throughout the 80s into the early 90s. And in the late 1980s, both men uh, got into controversy, partially for stuff that they wrote, which I don't think should be controversial. I mean, they were criticizing America's relationship with Israel on nationalist grounds, and I think that's fine. But these men were also, had anti-Semitic attitudes towards Jews. With Soburn infamously praising insaturation, you know, like basically a newspaper. Um, Now, Buckley was challenged on this by the sort of neoconservatives, the former Cold War liberals who had become moved to the right, many of whom were Jewish, and even the ones who weren't Jewish were almost all of whom were like, you know, very strong Zionist. And was a kind of conflation of the sort of anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism issue, but I mean, I do think that the a lot of the neocons, who, you know, frankly were perfectly willing to work and praise um, anti-Semitic political forces like Pat Robertson or the junta in Argentina, but you know, did not like it when people on the right were critical of Israel. They made a big issue of this, and Buckley, you know, famously in 1990 did a long 1991 did a long um magazine length article in National Review where he did, you know, in very convoluted language disavowed Buchanan and Soburn. But you know, like with that disavowal, shortly after that magazine came out, like within weeks, National Review endorsed Pat Buchanan for president as a sort of proper protest vote against what was seen as the sort of George Bush Sr.'s excessive moderation and liberalism. So, you know, the disavowals were never that full. And in the case of Soburn, he was fired from National Review when he became critical of Buckley's, and especially sort of indicated that Buckley, you know, had been betraying his kind of Catholic roots. Was fired in the early 1990s, but um, even after Soburn was fired, Buckley would continue to send money to him. And so, you know, there's ways in which Buckley continued to maintain these kind of social ties. And in the 90s, you know, when maybe the last period where Buckley was heavily involved with the magazine, a lot of the sort of scientific racism of Charles Murray, you know, was published in the magazine, as well as the sort of anti-immigrant views of Peter Brimlow. And all of this was very influential on the later alt-right. So again, I think all along Buckley was playing a kind of shell game, seeing, you know, how much he could do to win over respectable liberals and to have them accept, you know, his version of conservatism as a legitimate thing, which is very valuable to the right, to have, you know, a figure that could appear on PBS and write in the New York Times magazine and be reviewed in the New York Times and be, you know, seen socializing with the elite of Manhattan society. Buckley's able to do that while also fostering the sort of much more conspiratorial, racist, and anti-Semitic far right. I mean, I think Buckley was doing, you know, all these things simultaneously and doing a kind of brilliant shell game of this. And all of this is very clarifying for the Tucker Carlson, Nick Fuentes situation and heritage. Because I think one thing is that maybe a Buckley figure is no longer needed. You no longer need someone to present the respectable face of the right. I think in the sort of current polarization of our American society, that kind of shell game is no longer necessary. And now we're seeing more nakedly what is the actual truth, which is that you have a Republican Party that has, like, you know, some center right, right wing people, but also has elements in it that are like avowedly racist and anti Semitic and conspiratorial and are part of that coalition. Everything that's happened with Nick Fuentes indicates that, like, you know, we're seeing an open acceptance of that thing, of something that used to be in the period of Buckley, something that you worked with but had to also disavow. Now that is like more out in the open. And I think that's a sort of significant change. So there has been a change, but I think it's less than what people think. I'll probably return to talking more about Tannenhouse in a future episode because it's such a rich book. But for now, I did want to like link it up with what's happening currently in the news. I will link below to my Nation review of the book, but I would strongly encourage everyone to also read Tannenhaus's biography and many of the other books I've read. I think one can really understand contemporary American politics by understanding the sort of very rich literature of the American right that has been written over the last few years. So I'll see everyone again soon.